I'm Rabbi Michael Schwab. For those of you who are not part of our community at North Suburban Synagogue Beth, I'm the rabbi there. We're in Highland Park, Illinois. And we are now presenting what has become an annual event, the Field Family Lecture. And I just want to say a couple words of introduction. Our synagogue really believes in study and in Torah and in learning and in trying to cultivate our minds and our souls so that we can engage in our lives in a more meaningful and impactful way. And I studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I know that Eli and Dinah Field, Aleichem Shalom, and the entire Field family feels very strongly that JTS does an amazing job of educating not only their students, rabbinical students, cantorial students, graduate students, List College students, all the other wonderful people who study there, but also they do all these amazing educational programs across the country and across the world. And we are so delighted that we have this partnership because of the generosity of the Field family, that we can bring amazing speakers and professors like Professor Vazotsky, who's going to speak in a bit tonight. And so we are so delighted to be able to bring this wonderful learning program, and we are so thankful to the Field family for making this happen for our community and for everyone else who's on the webinar tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you Larry Field, one of the sons of Eli and Dinah Field, one of the fabulous congregants at our synagogue, North Suburban Synagogue Beth, and I'm delighted to have him begin tonight.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. Good evening. I'm pleased to join you for tonight's lecture. When I was asked to share the history between my family and Bethel and the Jewish Theological Seminary, my thoughts immediately went back to growing up in a household filled with 5 children. Synagogue was always an important part of our lives. In fact, my earliest memory was going to synagogue and sitting with my father and my grandfather. The Field family's special connection to Bethel began on a snowy Sunday in 1951 when my parents, Eli and Dinah, took a ride to Glencoe, Illinois, to view a house for sale on Hochfelder Road. My father fell in love with the house. He said it reminded him of his home in England. The rest is history. Almost immediately upon moving to Glencoe, my parents joined Bethel. At the time, Bethel membership was only 200 or 300 people. My dad became active at Bethel. He joined the men's club and then became active on the membership committee and other committees. Eventually, he was asked if he would want to be president of Bethel, and he served as president from 1961 to 1963. During that time, the sanctuary was built through a fundraising campaign. The sanctuary was never named, and around 1967, after a second fundraising effort to retire the mortgage, the sanctuary would be named the Field Sanctuary. That was a humbling and deeply moving occasion for our family. The congregation was like family to my parents. My mother and dad developed many close relationships that lasted a lifetime. My dad developed a close relationship with Rabbi LeBeau during his tenure at Bethel. When Rabbi LeBeau accepted the position of Dean of the Rabbinical School and Vice Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, their friendship continued and they spoke at least once a week. My dad got involved with the seminary and served on the seminary board of overseers. He was honored in 1992 when he was given the Seminary National Community Service Award. After our Rabbi LeBeau tenure at Bethel, my dad became immediately connected with Rabbi Kurtz. On their first meeting, Rabbi Kurtz extended his hand for a handshake. My dad said, "We hug around here." My siblings and I, our children and grandchildren have celebrated many Simchas as part of the Bethel family. Rabbi Lippis, Rabbi Dresner, Rabbi LeBeau, Rabbi Kurtz, and now our Rabbi Schwab have provided spiritual support and leadership to us and to each and every member of Bethel. Under the guidance and effective spiritual leadership of Rabbi Schwab, our family looks forward to a bright future as part of the Bethel congregation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to tell you a little bit about our guest tonight. We are absolutely honored to have Rabbi Bert Visotzky here, because especially he's a Chicago native, although currently he serves as the Appleman Professor of Midrash and Interreligious Studies at JTS, where he is also the Louis Stein Director of the Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies. He also directs the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue. He's written 10 books and edited 4 others, and he's currently co-editing a 3-volume compendium, Judaism, Volume 1, and Volumes 2 and 3, about history, literature, and culture and modernity. His book, Aphrodite and the Rabbis, How Jews Adapted Roman Culture to Create Judaism as We Know It, was published in 2016. And I will take just a moment's privilege to say that I was able to take a remote session class on that book and on this thinking, and I incredibly appreciated it, and especially appreciated Rabbi Visotzky as a teacher. He recently served as the co-editor of The Changing Face of the American Jewish Family, and he also serves on the UN Multi-Faith Advisory Council and the Board of Governors of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, and he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. We're very, very pleased that he is here not only to serve as the Field Family Lecturer, but also as part of our High Holiday Boot Camp series that we are virtually preparing during Elul to get ready for the holidays. Rabbi Visotzky, thank you for joining us tonight. We so look forward to learning from you. And I'll just mention that I put the link to your source sheet in the chat, so anybody who hasn't yet had a chance to peruse it, please go ahead. Rabbi Visotzky, thank you.
Thank you, Ellie, and thanks for letting me know that this is boot camp. I never thought I would be in a position of being a drill sergeant, but here we are. It's fabulous for me to be back at Bethel. I taught at Bethel 50 years ago, that's 50, when I was a student at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and living in West Rogers Park on the north side of Chicago. And I used to drive up once or twice a week to Bethel, and some of my fondest memories are there. I've been through a lot of the rabbis that Larry Field mentioned, I think starting with Sam Dresner. And I want to thank in particular the Field family, not only for this lecture series and for all that they've done for the synagogue, but also for your continual support over so many years of the Jewish Theological Seminary. I particularly want to note Rabbi Schwab. I didn't realize before tonight just how wise a man he is, because when we were discussing his time at JTS, he confessed to me that he had managed to escape being in one of my classes. On the other hand, Rabbi Friedman and Cantor Tisser met in one of my classes. I didn't make this up. Cantor Tisser referred to it as a shidduch. So I'm sure you're one big happy family there at Bethel. I particularly want to thank Ellie and Marcy Eskin and JTS's Tani Schwartz-Herman for the hard work that it takes to put this kind of an evening together. I've heard rumor that in a few weeks it will be Rosh Hashanah yet again. It's sometimes hard to know these days with the virus and everyone locked down. I find it sometimes hard enough to remember when Shabbos is, let alone that Rosh Hashanah is coming. But I'm sure all of you know that on the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, one of the great dramatic moments is the Torah reading, when we read on day 1 what I will refer to as the expulsion of Ishmael, Abraham's beloved son. And then on day 2, we read the portion beginning with Genesis 22. That should be on your source sheet, and I'm going to read a modified English translation. That is to say, I cut and pasted an English translation for you, but I'm going to change it as I go. And it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am, Hineni. And he said, take your son, your only son, whom you love. Take Isaac and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there for a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will tell you. So Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young servants with him and Isaac his son. And he broke wood for the burnt offering and rose up and went to the place that God had told him. And then on the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place far away. Abraham said to the young men, "Stay here with the ass, and I and the boy will go and worship and come back to you." So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son Hineni." And he said, "Well, here is the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "My son, God will provide a lamb for the burnt offering." So they went, the two of them together. And they came to the place that God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar atop the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand. He took the knife to slay his son. And an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Hineni, here I am." And he said, "Lay not your hand upon the boy. Don't do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him for a burnt offering in place of his son. Back when I was teaching at Bethel, the Vietnam War was still going on. And I was a kid. I was a teenager, not yet 20 years old. And when I would read this story twice a year, once on Rosh Hashanah and once on Parashat Vayera, I identified very powerfully with Isaac. I felt as a young man, an American, with a lottery number in the draft, that I was being offered on the altars of my father's ideology. Time went on, the Vietnam War ended, I went to rabbinical school, I got ordained, I got married, I had an infant at home, and I identified then very powerfully with Abraham. I could not imagine a God who would ask a father to take his son and slaughter him as an offering. Who could think of such a thing? Then my kids became teenagers. Suddenly that voice was maybe even reasonable on occasion, because there were those moments that I really wanted to tie up my kids and offer them. As it happens, I didn't. And now I have a grandson who I can read stories to. And that is everyone's great pleasure. But the story itself has captured the imagination of readers almost from the first moment it was told. Clearly, the early Jewish community embraced the power of the story. And we know this because they chose it as the Rosh Hashanah Torah reading. Now, it's true, there's a ram's horn in the story, and we blow the shofar. But they could have chosen some other passages, like what they chose for Maftir or for the Haftarah, but they focused on this story. It was powerful. It was powerful because I think all of us are aware that the choices we make, the religion we follow, the God we worship, all of that makes demands not only on us, but on our children as well. And I sometimes think about my kids and my grandson, and I wonder, as I'm sure Rabbi Schwab does and the rest of the clergy, if you have kids, what have I done to my children? I've made them rabbis' kids. They will be traumatized forever. I'm sure at Bethel, everyone is very kind to the children. I know that to be the case. But even in the earliest of the Jewish communities that were not, how do I say this, mainstream, there was a Jewish community, apparently an observant Jewish community, that nevertheless thought that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah, and maybe even thought that Jesus was God. And sometimes between the year 50 and the end of the first century. In that second half of the first century, a letter was written. Nobody's quite sure who wrote the letter. Early on, they thought maybe it was St. Paul. Later, church fathers by the 3rd century doubted it was St. Paul, but it's called the Letter to the Hebrews. It's part of the New Testament. And I want to read a passage from the New Testament because you'll watch them reread the story of the binding of Abraham's beloved son, and they'll be reading it through the lens of someone who believes in Jesus. So it's the New Testament epistle to the Hebrews, chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, being tested, offered up Isaac. Yes, he who had gladly received the promise was offering up his one and only son, even he to whom it was said, "In Isaac your seed will be called," accounting that God is able to raise up even from the dead. Speaking figuratively, he also did receive him back from the dead. So this is the author in the 1st century rereading our story, and if you hear the echoes, you can hear that it's the echo of the story of Jesus's death and resurrection. And the faith, which is the faith that Paul and early Christians pound on, faith, faith, faith. The faith is in not only Jesus, but in the resurrection. And I put in parentheses, the Greek text says, figuratively speaking, the Greek says, en parabole, in a parable. This is Christian allegory. What does it mean that it's Christian allegory? It means, well, let me define the word allegory. Allegory literally means this is that. So if Isaac is the sacrifice in Christian allegory, Isaac is Jesus. When the New Testament reads allegorically and reads through the lens so that everything refers to Jesus, that is called typology, because Jesus is the type for which they're always reading. Christian reading is consistent that way. So let's jump a few centuries, and we'll watch how one of the greatest of the church fathers, St. Augustine, I'm saying it with the British pronunciation, St. Augustine. If I were to say St. Augustine, you'd think that's where everybody from Highland Park goes during the winter. So I just want to be clear that it's St. Augustine. He lived in North Africa, in Kippur of North Africa. That's modern Tunisia. And he was a bishop there. And after the sack of Rome by the Goths in the year 410, he was so shaken that he wrote a very long book called City of God. The City of God was not Rome, and it was not Jerusalem, but it was heavenly Jerusalem, heavenly Rome. He imagined that there was some life beyond. And along the way, Augustine interprets just about everything. But when he comes to our passage, he says as follows. This is from the Latin. In this way, the passage of the epistle to the Hebrews can be understood and explained. By faith, he says, Abraham overcame when tempted about Isaac, and he who had received the promise offered his only son, to whom it was said, "In Isaac your seed shall be called," thinking that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. So this is Augustine translating the passage that I just read to you from Hebrews, but Augustine does not read Greek, so he's translating it from a Latin translation. And now he adds, from whence he received him in a similitude, which is to say, a parable. So now Augustine is going to do his interpretation. This is, if you will, his drush. In whose similitude? But his, of whom the apostle says, the apostle here being Paul, he spared not his own son, but delivered him up for us all. So now you can see he's quoting from Paul's letter to the Romans, exactly how Christian allegory works. Christians read the Akedah as predicting the death and resurrection of Jesus, and watch him try and make the parts all fit. He'll see if he can make them congruent. On this account, Isaac also himself carried to the place of sacrifice the wood on which he was offered up, just as the Lord carried his own cross. Okay, so now you know how to play the game, right? Anything that sounds like you can read it into the New Testament story, that's what he's going to do. Finally, since Isaac was not to be slain after his father was forbidden to smite him, who was the ram? And the Latin here is a little squishy, because ram could also be a lamb, by the offering of which the sacrifice was completed with typical blood. For when Abraham saw him, he was caught by the horns in a thicket. What then did that represent but Jesus, who before he was offered up was crowned with thorns by the Jews. So you see that the early church embraces this story wholeheartedly, and they see Isaac as a type for Jesus. I have to say, Augustine is somewhat disingenuous because he knew his New Testament certainly as well as I know New Testament. And I have to tell you that if you read the story of Jesus's crucifixion, one of the things you'll see is that it was not, in fact, the Jews who put the crown of thorns on Jesus. It was the Romans. So Augustine, as it were, is rereading the story. And while he's rereading it, he gets an extra opportunity to stoch the Jews. He was not a great Philosemite, but he was a great interpreter of both what he would call the Old Testament and the New. So I think I've made a case here, and it remains the case, that when Christians, who I remind you, believe themselves to be new Israel, true Israel, veris Israel, they read this story as their own, and they read this story as predicting the death, the resurrection, the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, a few years have to pass, and just actually a couple of centuries after Augustine, in what we would now call Saudi Arabia, in the Hijaz, arose a man named Muhammad. Now, you've all heard of Muhammad, and you know that he is the founding prophet of Islam. And we're going to actually see how that plays in to the story of the revelation that Muhammad received. For those of you that don't remember dates, I'm going to give you an easy mnemonic. Give or take a year, Muhammad first started hearing revelation from the angel Jibril. Jibril is Gabriel. The angel appears to Muhammad and commands him, recite. Muhammad says, recite what? He says, recite what I tell you. That took place on our calendar just around the year 613. So that's a number that many Jews can remember, 613. I'm sure Rabbi Schwab tells you about 613 all the time, but perhaps in a different context. He's talking about mitzvot. But in the year 613, Muhammad begins to have the revelations, and eventually, when he can return to his family and recite them, eventually they get written down. The first Quran was written just at the end or just after end of Muhammad's life or just after he died. There are extant today. I've seen one with my own eyes in the Islamic Museum in Doha. Copies of the Quran that were written within 100 years of Muhammad's death. So it's an astonishing thing that there is such a powerful tradition of the story. And I want to read from a surah, a chapter of the Quran. It's the 37th chapter. It's called The Ranks. When we originally made the pages for Ellie to distribute, we tried to put both the Greek of the New Testament and the Arabic of the Quran on the pages. But for mysterious reasons, they got garbled. So we'll stick with English. But you'll just have to trust me that I'm doing the Arabic correctly. Muhammad is now hearing the revelation from Jibril, who's telling Muhammad about Ibrahim, their father. Ibrahim said, I'm going to my Lord, he will guide me. Ibrahim says, my Lord, grant me righteous children. Now this is Allah. If you hear the word Allah, you should think Elohim or El. It's the same word. We gave him good news of a good child. When he grew enough to work with him, Abraham said, "My son, I see in a dream that I am sacrificing you. What do you think?" And he said, "Oh, my father, do what you are commanded to do. You will find me, God willing, patient." I want to reread that with a word of Arabic in it. You will find me, God willing, inshallah, patient. So many times you hear Muslims use the term inshallah, and it's a contraction for inshallah, if God wills it. So when the son said to Abraham that he will be patient, they both submitted. The verb for submitted, aslama, is the same root as the word Islam. So this is the origin story of Islam. In this moment, the first Muslim is created. Who is the first Muslim? Not Muhammad. According to the Quran, the first Muslim is Abraham. Just like we Jews would say, the first Jew is Abraham. So it's fascinating how the Muslims living in Saudi Arabia, knowing the Jewish community there, probably even knowing Talmud and midrash, adopt our worldview, and it comes into their revelation, so that submission to Allah by Abraham is the founding moment of Islam. And then Abraham put the son's forehead down to sacrifice him. Now, in rabbinic culture, we do something that's called smichat yadayim. We do smicha. We push the head of a sacrifice animal down to the ground so we can slit its throat. Right? So that's what the Kohanim do. On Yom Kippur, you'll read pretty much all morning about how the Kohanim slaughter the animals on Yom Kippur. That's called smicha. For the rabbis who are listening, it's the same word. It's when they push you down to the ground and slit your throat. So don't get too excited about having smicha. It doesn't always end well. Well, at least if you're an ox, it doesn't end well. So now Abraham is about to slaughter his son. You'll notice the posture, though. The son is on his knees, bowed down so that his forehead is touching the ground. Almost all of you have seen Muslims at prayer. That is exactly the posture that they assume when they pray. They are submitting, like the son of Abraham did, to Allah. And then Jibril, the angel, says, "We call to him, O Abraham, you have believed the dream. Thus we reward the righteous." That was an exacting test indeed. We ransomed him by substituting an animal sacrifice. In other words, exactly what we have in Genesis 22. They substituted out. The son no longer needs to be sacrificed. Now we will sacrifice an animal. We preserve this story for subsequent generations. Peace be upon Abraham. Alav hashalom. Thus we reward the righteous. He is one of our believing servants. We gave him the news about the birth of Isaac to be one of the righteous prophets. We blessed him and Isaac. Among their descendants, some are righteous and some are wicked transgressors. This is the fundamental core story that is not only about the birth of Islam, but also causes a great deal of ruckus sometimes between the Muslim community and the Jewish community. Muslims have on occasion quoted that last line, among the descendants of Abraham, some are righteous and some are wicked transgressors, and Jews take umbrage, feeling that the Muslims are insulting them as wicked transgressors. But what the Quran is saying is that the descendants of Abraham can be either or. We know that to be true in the Jewish community. We know that to be true in the Muslim community. We know that to be true in the Christian community. Sometimes we even know it to be true in our own selves. And maybe that's part of the reason we read this on Rosh Hashanah, because we're doing teshuvah. And we know that maybe we have been occasionally wicked transgressors, and we are trying to move towards righteousness. But I want to point to something else There's only one son mentioned in this passage, and the son who is named is Isaac. But the son is named after the story of the submission. This has given rise to a great deal of confusion in the Muslim community about the subject of the story. Because they are great believers in being shahada, in being witnesses to the power of Allah, they very much want their ancestor Ismail to be the son who was offered. They want Ismail to be the one who literally stuck his neck out. And they will argue, because I've unfortunately found myself in those arguments, that it must be Ismail and not Isaac. Why? Because they will tell us our own Torah, which we read earlier, says, take your son, your only son, whom you love. And they ask then, well, which of the two boys, Ismail or Isaac, was ever an only child? And the answer is Ishmael. So they believe that Ishmael is the son of the sacrifice, which is why, by the way, I was so cagey when I titled this lecture, The Beloved Son. I didn't want to say Isaac, I didn't want to say Ishmael. I will say for the record, though, that in the 9th century, so it's 2 centuries after the Quran, one of the great Islamic historians named Al-Tabari writes quite openly that in the Muslim world, interpreters are divided 50-50. Half of them believe Isaac was the son because they know the Torah, and half of them believe Ismail is the son because he is the father of the Arab peoples. So in the Muslim world in the early centuries, there was a disagreement, a machlokas, between those who thought it was Isaac and those who thought it was Ismail. But as time went on, and I can tell you this today, 99.9% of Muslims alive in the world today, whether they're observant or non-observant, whether they're Shiite or Sunni or Sufi, they will tell you the son who was offered by Ibrahim to Allah was Ishmael. So we have a fundamental disagreement here about who was offered. But I want to say, and I want to be clear about this, that both Christianity and Islam seem to have a culture of self-sacrifice. The early church fathers, taking Jesus as their type and Isaac as their type, encourage running to martyrdom, that martyrdom is a good thing. In the Muslim world today, we know there are radicals, terrorists, who in their message of Islam, they want to be martyrs and they want to be suicide bombers. The trouble is, the story's found in the Torah as well. And we have a father who's willing to offer a son, and perhaps even a son who's willing to be offered. When I was a kid, during the time actually that I taught at Bethel, and before, Larry mentioned 1967 as a date. That was the year I went on Ramah's Israel seminar. And we went to Israel 1 month to the day after the Six-Day War. And we were all full of the bravado of the miracle of the Six-Day War. And the phrase we heard again and again was from Trumpeldor. And the phrase was, Tov lamut ba'ad artsenu. It is good to die for our land. There is a culture, occasionally, of martyrdom in the Jewish community. Nebuch, Ellie mentioned that I just finished editing a 3-volume work cleverly titled Judaism. Volume 1 is history. And I have to say that throughout Jewish history, we as Jews, have not run to martyrdom. Once we get sacrificed, and that happened all too often, then we look at those who died al Kiddush Hashem, and we call them martyrs. But unlike the church fathers who exhort you to martyrdom, and unlike Muslim medievalists who exhort you to martyrdom, I don't think that has been the overwhelming ethos in Judaism. Nevertheless, I think we have to own it a little bit, that we have the same instinct that I want to die for something, and I want to believe in something so much that I'm ready to die for it. You will see whiffs of it, notes of it in the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur liturgy. And I remind you that a lot of that liturgy is written in the aftermath of the Crusades, and then the Inquisition and the expulsion. So we are after the fact martyrs, but still it's there. So how do we respond to this? How do we respond to the fact that the other religions of the book, Christianity and Islam, which, let's face it, is approximately 2/3 of the world's population, that they have appropriated this seminal story that's at the heart not only of our Jewish identity, but of our Jewish celebration of the high holidays. So I want to come to a midrash. I'm holding up a book. It's a midrash. It's called Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. It dates from exactly the time of Al-Tabari, the 9th, 10th century. It was written probably in a Jewish community that had recently gone from Christian rule to Muslim rule. The Jews suffered, though. And even though they suffered, they had faith. In Pirkei Avot, a work from the 2nd century, which I assume most of you know that you study it on Shabbos, particularly between Pesach and Shavuos. It's in the back of your Siddur after Shabbat Mincha. In Pirkei Avot, it says that God tried Abraham 10 trials. And in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, this 9th, 10th century midrash, he actually lists all the trials. What's the 9th trial, the penultimate trial, the trial that almost put Abraham over the top? Chapter 30 of Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer reports that that was the expulsion of Ishmael. The first day of Rosh Hashanah's Torah reading. That was Abraham's 9th trial. And Abraham was deeply, deeply disturbed by it. He didn't want to expel Hagar and Ishmael. Sarah was insisting on it, but God backed her up. God said something that every man should listen to. God said to Abraham, everything your wife says, hearken to her voice. That was God speaking. And all of the women who are on this call, you should find that quote in the Torah and repeat it often. In our text, in the midrash, Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer imagines that when Ishmael is expelled, he goes to Saudi Arabia. And there his mother finds him, his mother Hagar, she is the mother of the Arab peoples. She finds him not one, but then a subsequent wife. In the midrash, his first wife is named Aisha, and his second wife is named Fatima. Now, it's not a coincidence that Aisha was the wife, the young wife of the Prophet Muhammad, and she became a partisan, a leader, a military leader of the Sunnis. And it's also not a coincidence that Fatima married Muhammad's nephew Ali, and those who were partisans of Ali, the Shiite Ali, became the Shiites. So first of all, we're talking about the Shiite-Sunni split, goes all the way back to Muhammad's immediate offspring. And our midrash embraces it and puts both Aisha and Fatima into the text. But then he gets to the last trial, the 10th trial, and it came to pass after these things that God tried Abraham. And the midrash simply says, the 10th trial. What is the 10th trial? It says, God would test Abraham time after time to know what was in his heart. Could he observe the mitzvot or not? Not like the epistle to the Hebrews or Paul, who says, oh, it's all about faith. Our midrash responding to that argument says, oh, no. It's all about performing mitzvot. Jews display their faith by performing mitzvot. And they prove it by quoting a verse from Genesis 26, where God says, because Abraham had hearkened to my voice and observed my commandments and my laws and my Torah, thus I shall reward him. Now the midrash goes on with its narrative. Ishmael came from the wilderness on that very day to visit his father. I always like to think, Ishmael was off at the university somewhere and he had enough laundry, he came home to do laundry or something, right? But on the very same day that God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son, that's the day Ishmael shows up at home. Rabbi Yehuda says, indeed, God revealed himself to Abraham and said, take your son. Abraham, the midrash reports, had pity on Isaac. I'm going to come back to that phrase. Abraham had pity on Isaac. And he said to God, Master of all worlds, which son? The son who is uncircumcised or the son who is circumcised? Now, this is curious because, in fact, both Ishmael and Isaac are circumcised. If you read in Genesis 12, you know that Ishmael was circumcised at age 13, and Isaac was circumcised on the 8th day. In fact, Ishmael and Isaac get all the same promises from God, one after another. The only difference is that Isaac gets the term brit, covenant, and Ishmael does not. But the language, the son of the uncircumcision, the foreskin, if you will, versus the son of the circumcision, that's right out of the New Testament. That's the language of Paul. So it's clear to me that the author of this midrash is responding both to Christianity, we do mitzvot, don't talk to me about faith, and as we'll see, he's responding to Islam as well. God goes on and says, take your son, your only son. Now, I mentioned earlier that Muslims use this as an argument to say that it must be Ishmael. Ishmael, and only Ishmael, was Abraham's only child. But in our midrash, Abraham responds to God and says, well, Ishmael is an only child to his mother, and Isaac is an only child to his mother. So it could be Ishmael, it could be Isaac. And then God says, whom you love. And our midrash astonishingly says that Abraham responds to God and says, I love this one and I love this one. I love both my sons. Wow, this is a rabbi saying that Abraham says to God, I love Ishmael, father of Islam. Finally, God says, take Isaac. Now, earlier I said that the midrash had suggested that Abraham had pity on Isaac. And I must say, for 30, 40 years of reading this text, I always assumed that when it said that Abraham had pity on Isaac, what it meant was Abraham wanted to save Isaac's life. He didn't want to sacrifice Isaac. But in the last number of years, particularly reading both Jewish and Muslim commentators, I've come to a startlingly different conclusion. I think now that when our text says that Abraham had pity on Isaac, what it means is he wanted Isaac to have the merit of being offered up for sacrifice. Chew on the horror there. That what Abraham actually wanted to do was get God to say, take Isaac. Because then Isaac, and by the way, we would have the merit of the Akedah. Now, when I say that to you, I'm going to ask you all to do something. That when you are contemplating the Piyut and the Torah readings on Rosh Hashanah, see how many times we invoke the merit of Abraham and Isaac who was offered up. And you'll see what I mean. It's almost as though Abraham could read the machzor and say, I will gain all the Jews' merit by offering Isaac. So as the story goes on, you know what happens. Abraham takes Isaac, he brings him up the mountain, and he ties him up. As it says in the midrash, Abraham puts his foot up on top of the kid to keep him from trembling too much, because he wants to shecht him properly. And in the midrash, Isaac says, Daddy, tie me up really tight because I'm nervous and I don't want to spoil your sacrifice. The pathos is overwhelming. But then the angel intercedes. And the angel intercedes and says, here's the ram, take the ram, offer the ram. And then the midrash, with a great, great wink at us, says, so at that moment, Isaac unbounds the ropes that bound him on the altar, Akedah, stood on his feet, and said, Baruch atah Adonai mechayeh hametim. Praised are you, Lord, who resurrects the dead. Because there's a recognition that Isaac, bound on the altar, is dead. He dies of fright and is resurrected. There's a recognition that the first bracha of the Amidah is the shield of Abraham, Magen Abraham. So surely the second bracha must be for Isaac. And it's Isaac who said, God who resurrects the dead. Now, I'm just going to summarize the end of the midrash, but you can pretty much predict that the ram, well, every part of the ram was offered, including both of its horns. The first horn is the horn we blow on Rosh Hashanah. And the second horn, that's the horn that will be blown by the Messiah at the end of days when God resurrects the dead. So this is a phenomenal midrash. It responds to Islam. It responds to Christianity. And I just want to end my part of the talk before we get to Q&A with one little last piece of the midrash. You'll remember that when I read the story from the Torah, that God tells the two boys, stay at the foot of the mountain. We're going to go up and daven. We'll come back to you. So the midrash says, so who were these two boys? And the midrash says, well, we don't know who lived in Abraham's house except very few names. So we must assume that the two youths, as they used to say in the movie, are in fact Ishmael and Abraham's servant Eliezer. So if Ishmael is Islam, who is the servant, it is Christianity. And Ishmael and Eliezer say to one another, you know, Abraham's up there on the mountain. He's shechting Isaac. I will be the one to inherit. So when Eliezer says this, Ishmael says, you're not going to inherit. You're a servant. You're a slave. You know, you're not going to inherit. And Eliezer says to Ishmael, and you Pirkei, you're not going to inherit. Abraham already threw you out of the house. At which point a voice comes from heaven and says, Lo ze yoresh velo ze yoresh. Neither Christianity nor Islam will be the one to inherit. It will be Isaac resurrected on the altar. And that is a phenomenal expression of faith. Here is a rabbi in the 9th century with literally the sword at his neck. He sees that Islam and Christianity will spend the next 700 years attacking one another. And we all know, friends, that if Islam and Christianity are fighting, who gets it in the neck? The Jews. And despite that, he showed faith that it would be Isaac who would inherit. And as a recognition of that faith, here we are, a millennium later, more than 1,000 years, and we are still telling the story of the binding of Isaac, how Christians read it, how Muslims read it, and most important, how we read it, and why it is at the center of our high holiday liturgy. Cantor Tisser, is it time for questions?
You know, there's nothing I dread more than asking questions in a panel full of rabbis and educators. I'm going to turn us here to, let's see. All right. Well, I guess now I'm on the screen. Hopefully it'll go back to you in a moment. We had some really interesting questions. First of all, thank you again so much for being with us this evening. I did enjoy my time learning with you in seminary and of course reading your books, and it's a privilege to learn from you again. We've had a number of questions, interestingly, some asking if you might be able to speak to other interpretations of the story. So I'd like to begin with those with your permission. One of which is from Professor Eisman, a professor emeritus at Temple University. Could you comment on the narrative of the Akedah in Josephus?
No, I can't. I don't remember it.
Okay. Well, then let's move here. This is a very interesting question. This is from a full disclosure watching and curious Christian who's with us tonight. Welcome. Thank you for being with us. Who says, I reject the characterization that Christians and Muslims have, quote, appropriated a Jewish story. Is there not a way to understand how the three foundational faiths share this story as opposed to tearing them apart? And I would add on to that, is it perhaps just a matter of reading the text to justify one's point or ideology? How would you respond to that?
I would respond with care and gratitude. I appreciate the question, and I accept the rebuke implied. I think, and those who know me know that I am indeed the director of the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue. I think there's a great deal to be said for Christianity and Islam as religions of the book and as authentic readers of the Tanakh. But I think also that in my perception of the Jewish community, the Hebrew Bible, which we read, has always been our patrimony. Christians indeed have a New Testament as well as the Old Testament. Muslims have their own revelation in the Quran. It's not quite the same as reading the Hebrew Bible. And I think that on one hand, while we recognize that each of the three religions uses it for their own ideology, on the other hand, I accept the notion that we should accept the idea that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam share a foundation story. We share a common ancestor. And in sharing that common ancestor, we should learn, of course, the obvious, that we are all somehow related to one another. We're all one big family. And like all good families, we need to learn to get along a lot better. So thank you.
A question when you were speaking about the interpretation of Saint Augustine, although Saint Augustine coming up in the next couple of months sounds great. If Isaac is a prototype for Jesus, according to Augustine, how can the ram also be Jesus?
One of the great things about doing allegory is everything can be everything. This is this is this is this is that that that. We do it as well in midrash, that we can take each part of a story, and when we do midrash, of course, and we interpret allegorically, it's always about God, Torah, Israel, and obviously never about Jesus and never about Ishmael. Well, Ishmael is a character in the Bible, but not Ishmael as father of Islam. But all interpreters take enormous liberty by reading loosely. And can I just say one more word? Augustine, in fact, goes so far as to say that there are, for any verse of Scripture, 4 levels of interpretation. And he writes them all out. In medieval times, we midrashists share that notion. We say that you can interpret according to Pardes, Pshat, Remesh, Drash, and Sod, that there are 4 possible interpretations. And in the best of them all, the rabbis say that any verse of Scripture has 70 facets. In other words, as been Hehe, or Ben Bagbag says in Pirkei Avot, hafoch ba vafoch ba dekula ba, that you keep turning Torah because everything's in it. I joked earlier about how when I was a college student, I read it one way, and when I was a father of infants, I read it another, and then when I was a father of teenagers, read it yet a third way. The words always stay the same, but year in, year out, when we come to it, we see new interpretations. So I think there's nothing unreasonable about making the ram or Isaac, any of them, equal to what you're trying to do. There's a certain amount of playfulness, but it's the playfulness that comes of great love of the text.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you a question that was brought here about the women in the story. Could you speak a little bit about Sarah and Hagar in the Christian and Muslim interpretations? There's an interest to know how the relationship between these two women and how they might be treated differently in other traditions.
It's a fascinating question. I'm sure that you appreciate that Sarah and Hagar had a very complicated relationship, one to the other, because they were both rivals for Abraham's affection. Hagar, the servant, by the way, in the Torah, I don't think Sarah ever calls her by name, the girl. But at one point in the Torah, the narrator refers to Hagar as Abraham's wife, almost giving her the same status as Sarah, because of course Hagar produced a child for Abraham. And I always imagine at the moment that Hagar realized she was pregnant, she, like a teenage girl would say, whatever, and fling her hair back. And Sarah, of course, went ballistic. Sarah literally physically abuses her. The term that is used for how Sarah abuses Hagar the Egyptian is, how about it, the same term in Exodus for when the Egyptians abused the Jews. So what goes around comes around. They have a terribly complicated relationship. God, or the angels, speak to Sarah. God speaks directly to Hagar. But in Genesis 22, neither woman has a voice. It's all male drama, lots of mansplaining, and therefore lots of terror.
Thank you. And I apologize to everyone. There are some wonderful questions coming through. And if only Rabbi Visotzky were on the West Coast, we might actually be able to keep going a couple of hours. But the hour is getting late. So we'll close with this final question. You made the point that the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac is all over the High Holiday Liturgy. What do you think the message the early architects of the service were intending to give? How can we take meaning from it today?
I think I want to be very careful with my answer because I've been at JTS since 1972. It's going on almost 50 years. And I am a scholar of rabbinic literature, of midrash, and liturgy. And I think that that kind of scholarship, knowing the history of the text, sometimes frankly gets in the way of me submitting to prayer. I have too much going on in my head and not enough going on in my heart. So I want to exhort people that yes, it's good to study, and yes, it's good to know the history of our liturgy. And I could guess at what the earliest liturgists thought when they were composing, say, the Aleinu or the High Holiday Liturgy, or what the medievalists thought when they were responding to the Crusades or to the Inquisition with the very poignant, gut-wrenching piyutim that we read. And I think it's up to every individual to find how that echoes in their own heart. But I think it's equally important that when you're in the synagogue or when you're at home zooming into your service, that you let the music, the beautiful music that Chazan Tisser will be singing, you let the words of Torah that your rabbis will be teaching, and you let that open your heart so that you can find meaning in this moment for you, here, now. We're in a terrible moment. We're in a moment of plague. When we read Unetana Tokef, the whole list is going to be meaningful. But the story, I think, on its own, will echo. There are many, many, many good books out there. on the Binding of Isaac. My favorite is one about midrash on the Binding of Isaac. It's by Shalom Spiegel, and it's called The Last Trial. But just Google Binding of Isaac books, or go onto Amazon and put that in, and you'll get at least a dozen good books if that is the way you want to approach it. I just want to say one last thing, and it comes out of Jewish mysticism. You know that in Jewish mysticism, the basic myth of Lurianic Kabbalah is that in order for God to create the world, God had to contract God's self. And in contracting God's self, the power of the divinity in the vessels exploded, and we spend the rest of our life doing tikkun, trying to repair the universe so that it can go back to its primordial balance. But what do they call that moment of contracting the self? That's what you're going to be doing when you push the button on your computer and you suddenly find yourself as a teeny little square on the screen. That's called tzimtzum.
Beautiful, Rabbi Vazotsky. Thank you. I wanted to, take a moment. There were so many great questions, and I just wanted to let folks know that, they were sort of asking like, and so now that you've been able to compare and contrast so beautifully the approach of the story, there are questions about other stories and the relationship between these foundational faiths. And I think one of the messages that, sort of sitting where we sit, and especially here as part of this series, in 2 nights, we're going to be learning with Rabbi Michael Schwab a theme that will continue throughout the year of Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, loving our neighbors as ourselves. And I think that your introduction of sort of being able to see this foundational story through multiple lenses and have us all questioning, the other characters of the story and the other perspectives and where they ultimately lead, is both a great question for Elul and for us as we think about our world and our relationship with other people. So I really encourage anyone who is interested to reach out to us and be able to join us on Wednesday night, 8 o'clock, again, Central Time, to explore this theme of loving our neighbors as ourselves. And I want to extend a great thank you to my colleagues, my community, the entire Jewish Theological Seminary and its fans spread across the globe, and especially to you, Rabbi Vazotsky. Thank you so much for being our field family lecturer this evening, and your privilege.
Yeah,
to go ahead.
I would love to wish everyone on the call a Shana Harbe Yoter Tova, that I hope this coming year is a lot better for you than this year has been.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone, and an early Shana Tova.